Many chairs for us to choose
from.
So
many chairs.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lane Becker. I'm the Director of Products and Startups at Code for America, which means, among other things, that I work with the companies that come through in our accelerator. And as Jen mentioned yesterday, we're looking at ways at Code for America to start to expand into the marketplace, because we see that the marketplace for startups, the ecosystem around them, really seems to be growing. And a big part of that, a big sign, I guess you could say, a big indicator, is the gentleman sitting next to me, Ron Bouganim. So, Ron, you, as David just mentioned, recently launched last week a $23 million fund called the GovTech Fund, specifically focused on government technology. And let's talk about it.
All right. Thanks for having me over.
It's nice to have you.
It's kind of surreal since I was at like the first one.
Yeah, Ron's been a big...
I've been around for a while. This is amazing. It's surreal.
Way to make your way on stage.
There you go. I got to raise a $23 million fund before I get an invite on stage. It's nice. It's OK.
Yeah, OK. We'll just keep going.
Go for it.
So, Ron,
yes, Lane.
I'm going to ask you some questions now.
Please.
Can you tell us, so you didn't call it the Civic Tech Fund. You called it the GovTech Fund. And I'm curious about how you define GovTech. What are the qualities? What makes a GovTech company? What is it that you're looking for with your fund?
Sure. So GovTech companies, GovTech startups, build technology infrastructure that operates government and helps government deliver services to citizens, their customers, if you will. We think of GovTech startups as really the operating system, building the operating system of government. And when thinking about GovTech, Civic Tech, for us, it's a continuum. So that might be one end of the continuum. We think about Civic Tech as sort of the operating system of the citizen. So it's really people-led technologies, things like elections, community organizing, legislation, bills, those kinds of things that really are a function of you as a citizen, versus the infrastructure, the day-to-day operations of government. Is how we think about the difference.
And what was the reason that you chose to focus specifically on GovTech instead of looking at the wider market of civic technology?
Well, so I think it's really a function of the work that I did at Code for America, the accelerator. The opportunity itself just sort of emerged as the screaming pain point within government that was truly venture backable was the actual core infrastructure. Not that this audience doesn't know this already, but the infrastructure is so, in many cases, is so archaic and in such desperate need for change that it was just obvious that, and that in combination with having seen so many great companies along the way, just growing at venture backable rates just made it seem obvious to me that there was an investment opportunity here as well.
So I'm curious, so you mentioned some of the companies that are growing furiously, and I'm actually curious how many people in the audience are part of sort of a GovTech or civic tech startup? Just more than there were last year. How many people would like to be, say, after their fellowship year? I guess the question I have is, like, what are the qualities? Like, are there, you say that there are certain companies that are really sort of exploding in terms of growth, in terms of opportunity. Like, what are the qualities of the GovTech companies that you see that are like that? I think for those who are perhaps thinking about starting their own.
Well, so, and I think we've heard a lot of the themes in the last couple of days as well, or here at the conference. I think the startups that we invest in are, first and foremost, just significantly better than the existing incumbent technologies. It's really the vendor ecosystem is more of an organic ecosystem. It's not like my startups are anti-vendors, or we have relationships with a lot of the large existing vendors. The reality is that a lot of the startups that we look at, they just have a completely different starting point from when they built their companies. So they're leveraging the cloud. A lot of existing vendors did not or do not. They start primarily with the user in mind. They're visually stunning, the products that our portfolio companies are building. They are leveraging modern application practices and stacks, technology stacks. Again, for this audience, that sounds so obvious, but it really isn't in the government, and it isn't necessarily obvious to some of the existing vendors. So I think this is really going to be, I think the emergence of the startups represents a growth of the entire ecosystem, and it's not about one or the other. It's now the existing vendors just have a lot more competition, and I think that's good.
So do you consider those, like, was it the emergence of those tools or the emergence of, say, cloud computing as something that was sort of a scalable commodity? Is that sort of everything that contributed to, I mean, why this moment for the GovTech Fund? Was it technology? Was it something else that was happening in the marketplace?
Yeah, so those are some of the characteristics of the companies, but they reflect the broader trends, right? And the broader trends that, because there have been companies in the government space, in the startup space for a while, right? If you go back to the 90s, we've all heard the stories of eGov and GovWorks and some of these things. I think there's been a gradual, so you have those companies in the 90s. I think they had a tough time. Like, there were some really interesting technologies, but their cost structures were such that they couldn't really compete, because they'd walk in and say, yeah, well, this is awesome, but it's $10 million. Well, that's the same as the legacy vendor, so we'll just go with that. And then if you fast forward to the sort of mid-2000s, you start to see some of the cost structures improving, and you start to see the emergence of platform companies, a lot of companies that were like doing multiple things, they're addressing multiple areas within the infrastructure of government. And now we're at a point, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years where you're starting to see companies, the cost structures, the cloud has brought that down so significantly, the cost of starting companies, that you're able to see companies now that can do point solutions and build very significant businesses off of that one point solution and do it very, very well. That was very difficult to do 10 or 15 years ago. I think if you overlay on top of that the massive budget constraints, the fiscal crisis a few years ago just devastated government budgets, and that's caused folks internally and within governments to think about their budgets a lot more. They have to do a lot more with less, as we say. I think the emergence of open data, we clearly talked a lot about that during the conference, that's another major trend. There's a big cultural shift going on in government that I've certainly observed over the last number of years, where CIOs, chief data officers, CTOs are now thinking about, they've grown up with startups. You know, they're of a generation where they're walking into these jobs with an iPad in one hand and literally in some cases technology from the 80s and 90s. And so that dissonance just doesn't work for those folks anymore. And so you see the emergence of, it just comes down to very simple. When a startup shows up now to sell to a government agency, the person sitting on the opposite end of the desk is listening. That really has only happened, I think, in the last few years.
So that sort of addresses, I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is reflected in the broader startup marketplace in terms of the change in tools, commodities, the opportunity for point solutions online. I'm curious, though, what are the things that are still holding back this particular market, if there are things still holding back this particular market? What do you see as the big challenges for the companies that want to move specifically into GovTech?
Yeah, so I think, I don't really think of those as challenges so much as like impediments. I think we're very early in a process. I may be a little biased, but I think this is inevitable. This is going to happen in the same way that you saw a lot of innovation in just corporate America, in the enterprise. It just took a little longer to get to government, and frankly, it's not such a bad thing that we don't necessarily want our government to be bleeding edge, but it would be better that they're not in the 90s. So it took a little while for some of these technologies to make their way into government. It's going to happen, but we're early in the process. So you're just not gonna see all the venture capitalists coming out yet. They're still learning about the space. I do lunch and learns with VCs. I meet with them. We sit for 2-3 hours. I educate them on the space. So I'm out there evangelizing. You're not going to see, right? I talked about the cultural shift. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes time, right? It takes time for agencies to, if they're going to move to the cloud, to actually move to the cloud, right? So all those things take a lot of time, and it's more a question of not so much impediments. It's just we need to let this movement kind of just mature. So as that happens, you're going to see more and more startups come into the space. It's such a big market. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide. After I launched, I got emails from Singapore and the Emirates. I mean, this is a global movement and global phenomenon. So it's just a matter of you have to just take it step by step.
Fantastic. Well.
Thank you.
Any advice? Well, before we leave,
I thought you were
one last question. Any advice, quick advice for somebody who's thinking about getting into the GovTech marketplace, somebody that's doing a startup?
You mean other than come talk to me? Yeah, I mean, we talked about some of the basic principles. and some of the basic features of startups that we've seen. So obviously adhere to those principles and stick to, like, it is tough because it's early. Clearly everybody in this room is transformers. These are the folks everybody in this room is, and beyond in the community of Code for America are really the folks who are at the front of this. And so it's tough, right? Because you oftentimes feel alone. But I think there is a growing community, and it's only going to get better. So I guess my fundamental advice is if you're really passionate about this space and you really identify a big problem, you have to kind of double down on being an entrepreneur. It's hard enough being an entrepreneur, and in an emerging space like GovTech, you have to double down on that. And I would just encourage people to stick with it.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Ron. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.